Almost 3 years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted our lives, but for the diplomats of one country in China, the pandemic was a nightmare. They were the targets of China's abuse. And our cover story tonight is about how China used its playbook of coercion and control on the diplomats of the United States. Let's start with the early days when the pandemic started in 2020. The United States had evacuated around 1,300 diplomats and their families. At that time, America had taken a strong position. The US vowed to not let authoritarian governments use the pandemic as an excuse to mistreat diplomats. But in the months that followed, the US made compromises. It put American diplomats and their families in harm's way. An American newspaper has published shocking details. Nearly every US diplomat who arrived in China after fall in 2020 was at risk. And going by this report, 16 individuals were imprisoned. That's the number according to the US State Department. But US congressional aides have privately admitted that the numbers are much higher. And going by their records, some 30 individuals were imprisoned and they spent weeks in locked rooms and often in squalid conditions. Arriving diplomats had to undergo multiple medical tests and were forced to quarantine for months. Families were separated. They were also monitored by China's health app. The US State Department was in the know. They knew the kind of treatment that American diplomats were being given in China. Now, let me be clear here. Not everyone was mistreated, but several diplomats had horror stories to share. In January this year, the acting chief of the US mission in China received a memo. It was 97 pages long. Let's tell you what they said. Diplomats on arrival were sent to one of the 2 hotels dedicated for quarantine. The American diplomats suspected these hotels were government-run. What happened once they went to these hotels? Adults and children older than 14 were required to remain alone in their rooms. In fact, in one of the instances, a teenager suffered mental health problems. And we have some details about the living conditions as well. Both of these quarantine hotels were unhealthy. The rooms were not cleaned for months. The Americans living there suspected the Chinese were collecting their DNAs. They had doubts about the COVID-19 tests as well. Families who tested negative on arrival suddenly tested positive later in quarantine. China sent these people to fever clinics. What are they? A whistleblower complaint describes them in great detail. They have small and dirty rooms for people to stay during quarantine. Some of them are located in converted shipping containers. Doors are locked. Windows are barred. And people who have stayed there honestly went through hell. The people in quarantine got no soap, toilet paper, towels, laundry service, not even potable water. There was no TV. At some locations, there was no Wi-Fi. Even children had to suffer. They were tested for COVID-19 using adult-sized nasal swabs. In some cases, this caused nosebleeds. Many had to be forcibly restrained for repeated nose swabs. One family of 5 stayed in a fever clinic for over 60 days. While they were there, they had to undergo more than 150 throat, nose, and blood tests. Can you believe that? All these revelations were again reported back to the US State Department. They received internal memos, emails, and cables. Clearly, American diplomats were unable to stop the abuse. So the whistleblowers are now approaching the lawmakers. And that is how all this information is seeing the light of the day. Now, as much as this story is about China's abuses, it also is about the failures of American diplomacy. The US State Department was clearly unable to push back. And in the end, the US diplomats and their families paid a heavy price. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.